Certain areas of the world have historically been crossroads of civilization. Timbuktu, Sicily, Constantinople, and Jerusalem played host to missionaries, diplomats, merchants, and armies crossing their lands in search of new opportunities. Central Asia was one of these crossroads. Situated between the centers of gravity in Persia, India, and China, Central Asia was pushed and pulled between competing cultural powers. They would deliver silk and other Chinese luxury products to Persia, and when they turned back to China, they would take European and Persian metals and ideas such as Nestorian Christianity and Zoroastrianism. From India, Buddhist missionaries poured out into the Silk Road, which, because of the foreboding heights of the Himalaya mountains, was the only outlet for India into the wider world. Indians succeeded in converting many of the cities and tribes of Central Asia to Buddhism before continuing their spread into Tibet, China, Korea, and Japan. These early missionary journeys are the source of the Buddhist relics in countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan, which are today Islamic. But despite its importance, the distance between Central Asia and the capitals of these great powers ensured that it was usually on the periphery of these empires. There have, however, been exceptions to this rule, times when Central Asia came to the forefront of history and, for a moment, had the chance to change the shape of the world. The events around the Battle of Talas in 751 between the Tang Chinese and the Abbasid Arabs was one of those times. The Tang had their origins in the 30-year life of the Sui dynasty of China. Although it ruled China for only a few decades, the Sui had united the lands of China for the first time in 150 years. The lands of the Korean peninsula had been under the domination of previous Chinese dynasties, and the Sui were determined to reassert China's supremacy over the Koreans. To that end, the Sui emperor ordered resources from across China to be gathered near Beijing for the invasion of Korea. 600,000 peasants were enlisted just to transport food for the army. Shipwrights worked day and night to finish the construction of 300 ocean-faring warships. Over 1 million men were conscripted into the army. The emperor bled the country dry as he organized this massive undertaking. Eventually, the emperor's army had gathered. 1,130,000 men departed for Korea. There were so many soldiers that it took 40 days for them all to begin marching. The lines stretched for 300 kilometers. Despite the overwhelming numbers, however, a failure to properly delegate authority led to repeated defeats for the emperor, who was personally overseeing the campaign. The Chinese invaded 3 times over the course of 3 years. Each time, they failed to subjugate the peninsula. The failure of the emperor's army in Korea, combined with the extraordinary sacrifices that the people of China had been forced to make in support of the invasion, led to revolts by both peasants and nobles. With her army defeated and her people in rebellion, the Sui Empire fragmented. From these ruins, the Tang Dynasty was founded by one of the Sui nobles, centered on the former Sui capital of Chang'an. The Tang quickly took the initiative and retook the rebellion lands of China, reuniting China within 5 years, and eliminating the risk of another fractured period in Chinese history. Although the Tang claimed to be descended from Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, their ancestors actually came from the nomadic people of the steppe. This nomadic heritage perhaps helped the Tang succeed more than any philosophical heritage would have. The Tang, perhaps due to their ancestry, were known to be excellent horsemen, and they placed a strong emphasis on cavalry in their reforms of the Chinese military. On the backs of their well-trained army, the Tang would extend China's borders farther than they ever had extended before. At the same time that the Tang were re-establishing central authority in China around 618, other powerful states were forming on their periphery. The Tibetans were uniting the plateau into a powerful empire under Songtsen Gampo. The Koreans held control of land deep in Manchuria, and the Eastern Turks on the Tang's northern frontier were asserting themselves anew, while their rivals, the Western Turks, were attempting to consolidate their dominion over a vast range of land that stretched to the Caspian Sea. Farther out, emissaries came from China's ancient trading partner, the Persian Empire, requesting assistance against barbarians from the west that were ravaging their homelands. These changes presented the Tang with serious dilemmas. To their immediate north, the Eastern Turkic Khagan had spent the early years of the Tang Dynasty launching large raids into Chinese territory. But in 626, the Tang had made peace with the Eastern Turks, agreeing to send tribute north to stop the raids. With this newfound friendship, the Eastern Turkic Khagan recruited Chinese advisors to reform the laws of his land to mirror the advanced government in China. This attempted reform caused huge discord among the tribes of the Eastern Khaganate, and open rebellion broke out. The Tang faced a monumental decision in 628. Should they repair the Great Wall and focus on rebuilding the Chinese economy, or should they dispatch their armies to subjugate the nomadic tribes of the Eastern Turks while there was a power vacuum, something that had never been accomplished before in Chinese history? For centuries, the Chinese had relied on their Great Wall and their cities to defend their civilization against the barbarian nomads, and many counseled the emperor to follow this tradition. Furthermore, the Tang had made peace with the Turks only a few years earlier, and to break this truce would be contrary to the morality of war that the Chinese believed in. Also worth considering was the fact that for the past 30 years, China had been in almost constant conflict, first with the Sui invasions of Korea, then with the rebellions against the Sui, and then the barbarian raids that took advantage of Chinese weakness. The Chinese economy and population were desperately in need of a period of peace. To cap off these considerations, there was the warning of the Korean campaign, in which a new Chinese dynasty had launched a major offensive against a barbarian state, only to suffer defeat, delegitimization, and the usurpation of their throne. The Tang seemed to be in a very similar situation only 15 years after the Korean campaigns of the Sui. On the other hand, this was an ideal moment to resolve the problems posed by a region that had been a threat to Chinese stability for centuries. Up until a few years prior, the Turks had been powerful enough to reduce the Chinese to the humiliation of paying tribute. If the Tang did not seize this opportunity, the Turks might quickly recover their strength. The Chinese were also keenly aware that a strong Turkic Khaganate would have the initiative to declare peace and war at times of its choosing, and the Tang were afraid that if they did honor their treaty with the Turks would break the treaty as soon as they felt they had the advantage over the Chinese. This mistrust was partly due to cultural differences between the nomadic Turks and the urban Chinese. Finally, although the Tang had respect for the traditional importance of the Great Wall, they thought that, as a practical matter, if they could decisively eliminate the threat of the nomads, the repair and maintenance of the Great Wall would be unnecessary. It's worth taking a minute and thinking about what strategy you would choose given all of these considerations, and given the radically different options being presented to the Tang Emperor. We can only definitively know the outcome of one of these choices, however. The Tang Emperor decided that it was time to confront the nomads directly, despite the risks involved. After all, the Tang had not become emperors of China by remaining satisfied with what they already had. Relying heavily on their cavalry, the Tang armies moved quickly into the Eastern Turkic Khaganate, much faster than the Turks had expected, and they were able to defeat the Turkic armies and capture the Khagan. After dealing with debates about whether to resettle the defeated Turks within China or allow them to stay on their land, eventually a military administration, the Anbei Protectorate, was set up to defend the Tang's northern border. In the Protectorate, Chinese military officers executed the emperor's will, but these military governors were given more freedom than the central Chinese provinces had, and could take immediate action to deal with crises without waiting for approval from the capital. From this beginning, The Tang rapidly expanded through campaigns against the old foes in Korea. They used their new dominion over the Eastern Turks to recruit cavalry from the nomads for campaigns against the Western Turkic Khaganate and the oasis states of Central Asia. Together with their Turkic allies, the Tang pushed into the Persian heartland and drew the borders of the Chinese Empire farther west than they had ever been before, or ever would be again. The Chinese influence now brushed up on the coasts of the Caspian Sea. Despite these successes, serious threats remained. To the north, the nomads of the steppe, though under Chinese rule, were far from humbled and would expel the Chinese at first opportunity. To the south, the new Tibetan Empire was an expansionist power that was raiding the Tang frontier. And to the west, the barbarians that had defeated Persia had become a powerful presence in Central Asia, reorganizing themselves into the Umayyad Caliphate. At the same time that the Chinese were pushing into the historically Persian sphere of influence, the Umayyad Muslims were using their Persian lands to push towards the historically Chinese regions of Central Asia. The seeds of a great conflict were sown, but two things mitigated an all-out war. First, the Tang used military governors to oversee client kings in the cities of their protectorate regions. Since these cities were not directly administered by the imperial court, hostile actions against a city by an outside force did not mean that the Tang would immediately respond. Second, these oasis cities of Central Asia occupied a foreboding and desolate land. Although the Arab armies had emerged from the deserts of Arabia, they now preferred to conquer lush and populated areas, not backward steppe regions. Nevertheless, conflict did occur at the beginning of the 700s. In 715, the Arabs overthrew the Tang client king in Fergana and put their own client in command of the strategic valley. The Chinese sent a 10,000-man army, which promptly restored the Chinese ally to the throne. 2 years later, in 717, the Muslim Umayyads allied with the Buddhist Tibetan Empire and the polytheistic Turkic tribes of Turgesh in Central Asia to seize the Tang protectorate of Angzi, bypassing the politics of the Fergana Valley and directly besieging the Chinese garrisons. Caught between this collection of enemies, the Tang quickly mustered a conscript Chinese army and sent it to relieve the cities of the west. Simultaneously, the Chinese called on their Karluk Turkic subjects to provide a cavalry force. The combined Turkic-Chinese army defeated the Arab-Tibetan Turgesh armies and led to the end of the Umayyad ambitions in Central Asia. The Umayyad Empire's Turgesh allies switched to supporting the Tang, and in 724, the Turgesh Turks inflicted another devastating defeat on an Arab attempt to take Fergana, and the Umayyad authority in Central Asia collapsed. Over the next few decades, a series of revolts shook the caliphate, culminating in the Abbasid Revolution and the establishment of a new caliphate centered on Baghdad in the year 750. In the year of the Abbasid Revolution, the city of Fergana once again became the axle on which history turned. The upcoming Battle of Talas would play out as a mirror image of the campaign 35 years earlier. Fergana called on Chinese aid to deal with their rivals in the city of Sash, modern-day Tashkent. The Tang obliged and sent a veteran army which had recently defeated a Tibetan army to assist the nearby Fergana. Together, the armies quickly captured the king of Sash. The crown prince of Sash then fled to the Abbasid Caliphate and requested their assistance. The Abbasids took this opportunity to reassert Islamic influence in a region that their rival Umayyads had been pushed out of. A large Muslim army marched north, supplemented by Tibetan forces, and the Tang responded by ordering the ethnic Korean general who commanded the Western garrison army to meet the Muslims. The Chinese once again called on their Karluk Turkic allies. The Chinese and Muslim armies, a world away from their homelands, met in the Fergana Valley to decide who would have the primacy in Central Asia. Although the Abbasid army was much larger, they were unable to break the Chinese until the Karluks turned on their Chinese allies and attacked them from behind. Attacked on both sides, the Chinese broke and fled. Only about 20% of the Tang army managed to return to China. The Islamic Empire now controlled the valleys of Central Asia. The Tang Empire's Korean general intended to lead another expedition to retake Fergana, but in 754, court intrigue in the Tang capital led to the rebellion of An Lushan, a Turkic general who commanded the Tang northwestern armies. An Lushan began marching towards the Tang capital with an army of 150,000 men. Although the Tang had immense resources and military power, most of their armies were deployed to garrisons in the protectorates. The Tang now faced a crucial decision. They could choose to take a defensive approach, slow down An Lushan's advance to the capital, and mobilize men and resources from the vast territory still under their control and form new armies to fight An Lushan. On the other hand, they could recall the already trained armies from the frontiers and adopt an offensive strategy against the rebels. In support of the offensive approach, An Lushan had veteran armies, but the Tang also had hundreds of thousands of veteran soldiers stationed on their borders. Recalling the armies and dealing a quick defeat to An Lushan would be the fastest way to end the rebellion before An Lushan could attract additional supporters or cause lasting damage to China. No doubt China's rivals such as the Tibetan Empire would take advantage of the power void left by the withdrawing Chinese garrisons, but the Tang had recovered from setbacks in the past, and they could reassert themselves in these regions when the rebellion was put down. Furthermore, to be successful against a seasoned general like An Lushan, the Tang would need their best loyal generals, all of whom were in command of the armies at the borders. On the other hand, the capital regions were surrounded by impassable mountain ranges that provided excellent defensive positions. If the emperor mustered a conscript army from the peasants, they could easily hold the mountain passes against An Lushan's veterans. This would give the Tang the time they needed to properly train and equip a new army. Although the interior of China would suffer from the rebellion, the peripheral border regions would maintain Chinese influence against their enemies. If the protectorates were abandoned, although it might be possible to retake them in the future, that would require a much larger investment of soldiers and wealth later on. Both tactics had strong arguments in their favor. Which option would have led to the greatest prosperity for Tang China? The Tang decided that protecting their heartland was the priority, and that the armies in the outer protectorates would have to be withdrawn to deal with the rebellion. Two of the Tang's best generals from the Western Protectorate, including the Korean general who had led the Tang forces at Talas, arrived with what soldiers they had immediately available. Because of the long distances between the rebels and the outer borders of China, less than 100,000 men had arrived as An Lushan approached the second Chinese capital of Luoyang. The Tang generals, outnumbered and under-equipped, agreed to adopt a defensive position in the mountains that would stop An Lushan from approaching the primary capital of Chang'an, where the emperor was located. When the emperor heard of this, he and his advisors were outraged. The whole reason for calling the armies back from the borders was to prevent this fall of the Chinese interior cities and avoid taking up defensive positions. The emperor ordered the two generals executed and appointed a new general to take over the army and lead it into battle. The Chinese army then moved out of its defensive position and engaged An Lushan in the open field for battle. The outnumbered and under-equipped Tang army was crushed by An Lushan. Very quickly, the situation had drastically changed. The road to the capital was open to the rebels. The emperor had recalled the forces from the borders to gain an advantage from the experience of his generals and soldiers. Now those generals were executed and the soldiers were dead. Out of options, the Tang emperor was forced to flee his capital and operate defensively henceforth. The Tang had gained no advantage by abandoning the border protectorates and were now forced to pray for a miracle to save their empire from the ascendant An Lushan. In fact, a miracle would arrive when An Lushan was killed by his son, who was then killed by one of An Lushan's generals, who was then killed by another one of the rebel generals, who then committed suicide to avoid capture by the Tang. Tang rule was reestablished over the devastated lands of China, but in the meantime, the Tibetans had taken over the cities of the Silk Road, the Muslims had entrenched themselves in Central Asia, and a new Turkic Khaganate had been established in the north. Enemies were all around, and the Tang would never be able to retake their possessions in Central Asia. Chinese armies would never again extend to the Aral and Caspian seas. As Chinese influence diminished, the Abbasids took the opportunity to convert many Turkic tribes in Central Asia to Islam, bringing them firmly into the Abbasid sphere of influence. Ironically, it was the earlier destruction of the great Turkic Khaganates by the Tang that ensured that Islamic, not Chinese, culture would dominate Central Asia. Without the strength of the Chinese-influenced Turkic Khaganates, the weak states and nomads quickly adopted the culture of the Muslim empire to the south. Later, the descendants of these Central Asian peoples would move west and dominate the Middle East for centuries. The decisions that the Tang made still reverberate in our world today.